Welcome to the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Melanie Jackson. I'm a clinical and research midwife with my PhD, and each episode I cast a critical eye over current maternity care practice by grappling with research and historical knowledge to help you get the best out of your pregnancy, birth, and postpartum journey. To get access to all the research that I use to create every single podcast episode, you can join the mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com. Hello, rebels, and welcome to today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion. Today I'm talking about free birth, and we'll directly draw from the work that I did for my PhD thesis. So for those of you who don't know, in 2014, 10 years ago, I received my doctorate degree, my PhD, so Dr. Melanie Jackson, Doctor of Midwifery, it's a fancy title. And my thesis was called Birthing Outside the System, Wanting the Best and Safest. My PhD was the very first thesis to be completed in Australia on the topic of free birth, and I've been following the academic research about free birth ever since. So my thesis was submitted 10 years ago, but I worked on it for 4 years through my first pregnancy, first birth, and so I've been immersed in this world of free birth almost as long as I've been a privately practicing midwife. Now, before I start this episode, I want to acknowledge that free birth is an emotional topic. I know this because of my vested interest in the topic and the choice of free birth, and also because every time I speak about free birth, I get emails and messages from lots of different people, mostly from women who free birth themselves, but lots of doulas and midwives, and most of these messages are constructive and respectful, and I learn a lot from having discussions with people around this. There are a small minority of people who message me to tell me I'm wrong, and that I don't understand, and that I have no right commenting on free birth because I haven't had a free birth myself, and because I don't attend free births. So I will start this episode by speaking to that. The topic of free birth can be viewed from multiple perspectives. So many people will look at it from an emotional perspective and only open themselves up to consuming and listening to information and opinions that match their own current feelings and understandings about free birth. So looking at it this way applies what we call confirmation bias. It's a known phenomenon. For someone who is exhibiting confirmation bias, they will automatically always assume that the only information that is right or accurate is the information that fits their own understandings and opinions. Everything else on the topic is considered wrong, and they will dismiss it or close themselves off to anything else because they assume that they're right and that they can't learn anything more because they have all the information they need. And they believe that what they feel about the topic or know about the topic is accurate and right. So this is called confirmation bias, and it's a form of bias. It stops people from expanding their understandings, and it leaves them trapped because they won't accept new information from anyone else, and they'll label it wrong or make personal attacks on people who oppose them. So that's one way. We all have confirmation bias about various things. The important thing is to acknowledge it and challenge your own confirmation bias if you're going to put yourself in a place of growth. So that's one way. The other way of looking at a topic is to remove emotion from it completely and look at the topic academically and objectively. And this is about welcoming all the information, opinions, stories, understandings about a topic, and reflecting on your own bias. And you would intellectually put that bias aside so that it doesn't get in the way of the truth of the information that's being presented. It's entirely possible that you don't know everything about a topic. Now, putting aside biases is what we're required to do when we write a PhD as academics, and really when anybody's doing research. The process is really dramatic when you're researching something academically, especially at the level of PhD. When I was researching this topic, I was challenged every week by my supervisors and throughout the research process to actively consider my own feelings and opinions about the topic and put it aside so it didn't cloud my research findings and methods. So acknowledging and regulating bias is a major part of the academic research process, and bias has no place in my research process because of how rigorous the process was. So when you're listening to this podcast episode, if you have an emotional response to what I'm saying and decide that I'm somehow wrong in my findings, before messaging me to call me names and tell me I'm wrong, I want you to first consider your own personal biases. Do you think I'm wrong because I'm not thinking the way that you're thinking, and I've just challenged your confirmation bias? I stand by the information I offer here today because these findings are not my personal opinion. They do not come from my mind. They are directly derived from the women's stories who agreed to share them with me over hours and hours of interviews. And the findings are drawn solely from the words and stories of women. I know this because the process that was used to come up with the findings were completely drawn from the interview transcripts from women's stories and words. To say that my findings are incorrect is to invalidate the stories of the women who have chosen to free birth. Now, very few people know what I actually think about free birth because I will only ever comment on what I've discovered through my research process by talking to women. So my research is derived from women's stories and experiences, and I'm simply the vessel through which these are being presented in the academic world. I now invite you to open your mind, seek to put aside bias and emotion, and listen objectively in a bid to try and listen to understand instead of listening to respond. Okay, let's get into it. So this work that I did for my PhD thesis is what I'll be drawing on today, as I said, to answer the question of what motivates women to choose free birth. Why do women free birth? And why do they perceive it as the best and safest option? Once we understand women's motivations, if you're a care provider, you'll be automatically equipped to care for them if they, for example, transfer into your care from home, or if they require additional support. And for those out there thinking, I just don't understand free birth, hopefully after this episode today, you will understand free birth. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the research process that I used, except to say that the findings from my research came directly from women's stories of free birth that they shared with me through their lengthy interviews. I've experienced free birth community members become very angry with me when I speak about free birth. They believe I'm not entitled, but this is not my opinion. This is from the analysis of the women's stories themselves. I am entitled to share these women's stories because they've given me permission to do so. And in this circumstance, research and researchers are simply the vessel through which women can transmit and share this information to people who are willing to read academic research and pay attention to research. So sometimes there's no other way of getting through to people who are making decisions, for example, in government and in policy, than to actually write a paper about it. So let's have a look at what the women said. So spoiler alert at the very beginning. Why do women choose to have a free birth? Women who choose to have a free birth do so because they genuinely believe that is the best and safest option available to them. This is no real surprise that women will make choices that are in the best interest of themselves or their family. But the bigger question is, why do they believe that free birth represents the best and safest option? And the answer to that lies in what the women prioritize for their births. And the women who I researched for my PhD gave a list of 3 really clear priorities. And this explains exactly why they chose to free birth. Now, before I give you the 3 priorities, I've heard women who've chosen to free birth say, we just free birth because we wanted to. Just because we wanted to. That's why. And I will say that when I interviewed women for this PhD, some of them started off their interview saying, it was just because I wanted to. But as we went through the interview, it became clear that things occurred to them and for them, and that they intellectually understood things that led to them just wanting to free birth. We don't just want to do something. We're complex human beings. There are rational and logical reasons for why we do things. So I don't buy that. I don't buy this statement that we just want to. And so this PhD was about digging and digging and digging and trying to understand why women free birth. And 3 things came up as overarching philosophies for these women. So firstly, they wanted to have a natural birth without any unnecessary interventions because they understood physiology and they understand that interventions can introduce risk to the birth process. So they wanted to have a normal physiological birth because they know about birth and that physiological birth is most likely to be the least complex. Number 2, they wanted to stay close to their family and support network, including their children. That was part of their motivation and priority for giving birth at home, is that they wanted to stay close to their family and support network. Number 3, and this is a biggie, they wanted to be respected as the authority at their birth. So those were the 3 priorities: normal physiological birth, staying close to family and support network, and being respected as the authority at their birth. Those are the overarching reasons why women choose to have a free birth. So then when they expertly and intelligently analysed the risk and benefits of all their birth options, free birth came out on top as the option that could fulfill their 3 main priorities for birth, but that also represented themselves as the best and safest option. And women recognised that they couldn't experience or fulfill their 3 top priorities within the maternity care system because an institutional birth couldn't meet one or all of their expectations. And because of this, the women cited shortfalls and disadvantages of the current maternity care options, and that was the major contributing factor to their choice to free birth. Their 3 priorities couldn't be met within the hospital system. And so the next question is, why did they think that the hospital or maternity care service couldn't meet these top priorities? Why did they think they couldn't have a natural, uninterrupted birth in a hospital? Why did they think that their family and support network would be distanced from them when they went to have a hospital birth? And why did they think they wouldn't be respected as the authority at their birth? Well, firstly, the majority of women that I interviewed had already had a baby in hospital or through mainstream maternity care services. But the ones that hadn't had other experiences with systems or with hospital systems or with government systems that inbuilt in them a mistrust of these services. And so it wasn't always the experience of a previous birth that made these women suspicious and reluctant to enter a hospital. It was other experiences with authority figures, with authoritative institutions and systems that discouraged them from engaging. But many of the women in my research described experiences where they were bullied, assaulted, degraded, and ignored at their last birth. And then through that experienced varying levels of dissatisfaction and trauma from their previous experience. And they knew that they had to find a better way than what happened last time. They looked at their previous experience and decided that can't happen again. I'm not allowing it to happen again. And they knew that because they'd already been within the system, within a system, they already knew what they'd be up against if they went back. And they weren't willing to put themselves at risk of that again because many of them were still recovering from the trauma they experienced last time. So why would they go back to a place that was emotionally unsafe the first time? It actually doesn't make sense. So what these women were able to do was look past the social messaging about the apparent safety of hospital birth and recognize that every single birth option in hospital or not had its own level of risk and safety. In any scenario, whether they gave birth at home or in hospital, there were elements of that birth that kept them safer, and there were elements that introduced new levels of risk. If they stay at home, the physiological birthing process was more likely to unfold without interruption, which they perceived would prevent iatrogenic or medically caused complications. If they stayed at home, they were not at risk of receiving unwanted medical interventions such as vaginal exams, episiotomy and medications, etc. They knew they wouldn't have to fight with their care providers for the right to make autonomous birth decisions, and they weren't restricted to outdated hospital policies. They could choose what they wanted to have and who they wanted to have with them. And those were just some of the things that they weighed up when they were making decisions about where to give birth. So these women knew, and they spoke about the inherent risks of giving birth. Because I know many of you thinking, but don't they know that they could bleed, and don't they know that there could be a complication, or that their baby might need help, and that they can't possibly have all the information they possibly need to manage every single potential complication? They know that. Before they free birth, they know that birth doesn't work all the time. And anybody who tells you that birth works all the time and that birth is only complicated because there's been an interruption or because you're frightened or something like that, that's not true. That is their confirmation bias. Birth doesn't always work, and women who free birth know that. But what they also know is that there are inherent and significant risks to entering a hospital system, and they're more willing to accept the risks of an uninterrupted birth at home without assistance than they are to accept the risks of having a supervised birth in hospital. So they look at their options within the system, and they saw some real deal breakers and couldn't convince themselves that under the circumstances they would receive the best and safest care in a hospital compared to what they would get at home. Remembering that their priorities, 3 priorities, non-negotiables. They wanted a natural birth without any unnecessary interventions. They wanted to stay close to their family and support network, including their children, and they wanted to be respected as the authority at their birth. And these women were very articulate in explaining all of the issues that they perceived they would encounter in hospital. And these things that they explained were enough to put them off going to hospital and to convince them that free birth was a way better and way safer option. So what did they say about the hospital? They said that the hospital doesn't have enough resources to cope with demand. They recognised that the hospital resources were finite and that they were at the mercy of understaffing, limited service capacity and funding, and the women did not want to be the recipient of care that comes out of an under-resourced service. I mean, yep, it's true. They don't have enough resources to cope with demand. Most maternity services are understaffed and they have restrictions due to finite resources. It's completely understandable. It's the reality of most systems. There are finite resources. But the women felt they didn't have the resources to cope with demand and that would impact on the care that they would receive. Next, the women said that the hospital is not like home. Hospitals don't have an environment that is comforting and warm and private. All the things that these clever women knew that they needed in order to make their birth environment most favourable. The hospital environment was not and is not like home. It doesn't facilitate the physiological needs of labour, and they knew that. Next, they described the hospital like a cattle yard. Everyone in, sent through the same gate, ushered along the assembly line for processing and out the other side. They didn't want to be treated as a number in the crowd and get lost in a system that doesn't see them as an individual, unique human. The factory-style birthing option that the hospital offered them was not appealing when they compared it to the soft benefits of their home with people that they loved and who loved them. They wanted humanised care, not birth by numbers. Now, these women did not fear birth, and they didn't see the need for medical management of birth if everything was normal and healthy. And what I want to say here too is most of the women that I interviewed said that they would have been absolutely willing to accept medical care in the circumstance of an actual emergency. What they didn't want was medical care in the absence of an actual emergency. So women who free birth aren't completely rejecting medical intervention. They're just rejecting unnecessary medical intervention into the normal physiological process of birth. They're not saying that they don't want medical care in the circumstance where there is an actual emergency. So they trust birth physiology and they trust their bodies. But they believed that the hospital feared birth, all kinds of birth, normal birth, complicated birth, every single birth was fearful to a hospital system, and that the services that they would be entering didn't trust the physiological process of birth. And so they would try and manipulate and control the woman's body to conform, and this violated their very first priority, which was that they wanted to avoid unnecessary interventions. So it made no sense to go to a place that has a reputation for giving lots of interventions in birth. Hospitals do offer interventions in almost every single birth, at least here in Australia. And most of these interventions are routine and not necessary for physiological birth. And so these women saw them as unnecessary. Why would they go to a location that gives unnecessary intervention when one of their major priorities is to have a birth without unnecessary intervention? It doesn't make sense to go to hospital if that is your mindset. So next, the women said that the hospital doesn't prioritize their emotional safety. And so the hospital was perceived as an emotionally dangerous location, and they were not willing to risk their emotional safety in exchange for the possible benefits that might arise out of giving birth in hospital. So when the medical system looks at safety, they're only looking at physical safety. They're not looking at emotional safety. It doesn't matter how many words are used, woman-centered care, whatever the words are that our maternity care system throws around to try and remind the system that they're supposed to be giving humanized care. At its core, it's focused on physical outcomes. It's not focused on emotional safety. And the women knew that. They had a priority for themselves to be kept safe across multiple planes of safety. And that includes emotional, social, cultural, psychological, and physical safety, not just physical safety. Now, finally, and potentially most importantly in the decision-making to free birth, women knew that if they went to hospital to give birth, there would be tension around their autonomy, remembering that one of their priorities was being respected as the authority at their birth. And they knew that staff would not be comfortable with the woman being the boss in the birth space. And these women specifically wanted to be respected as the authority in their birth. They wanted to be the boss of their birth space. Rightly so, in my opinion. That's the only thing that's in my opinion in this episode. Okay, so recap. 3 very sensible and appropriate aims for their births for women who are planning free birth. They want to have a natural birth without unnecessary interventions. They want to stay close to their family and support network, including their children. And they wanted to be respected as the authority of their birth. And through careful examination and with their capacity to think for themselves and reject authoritative medical social messaging about birth, they weighed up the risks and benefits of all their options, and free birth came up on top. And the reason for this is the inherent shortfalls in the system. The system fails to meet the unique needs of women. Some women are willing to accept the shortfalls of the system for the benefits that they perceive they will experience within the system. Women who free birth are not willing to accept the shortfalls of the current maternity care system. They have a mindset that favours social, low intervention birth, and holding themselves as the authority in their birth choices, they confidently chose the birth option that they perceived was the best and safest for them. Now that, in a teeny nutshell, is the cherry on top of my thesis findings. There are far more things that I could discuss in this episode, but I would be talking for hours and hours and hours because the thesis is 100,000 words long. If you want to read my PhD thesis, you can get full access to the entire thing if you're on the mailing list for this podcast, because people on the mailing list have access to the resource folder for this podcast. And in the resource folder, I'll also put the full text journal articles that I've written about my PhD. So if you don't want to read the whole thing, you can just read the little summary articles that were published in academic journals. But what I will say is that women who choose to free birth recognize that they need to find a better way to give birth. And through various avenues, using their own intellect and decision-making process, they came up as free birth as the best and safest option for them. The next thing I'll say is that free birth is a relatively new phenomenon. It's not historically what women would have chosen for birth. Historically, it was a social event with many women around. Men were excluded from the birth space predominantly, but there was historically and typically always a wise woman or midwife in the space who was a skilled birth attendant. And that skilled birth attendant would have had an apprentice who would have learnt from that attendant over time, and then gradually that apprentice would have taken over from the village midwife or the local midwife or wise woman or medicine woman to attend women giving birth. And their role was to assist if there was a complication. And so free birth is relatively new as a social phenomenon. There are some small communities who developed practices where the women went out and gave birth on their own, but historically and predominantly, midwifery was a skill set bestowed upon selected members of communities, and the midwives were respected and revered, and part of the social fabric of communities. They were invited to the births, and the births were a social event rather than an exclusive event. And so the theory is that free birth was actually born out of necessity, because women will always choose the best and safest option, and currently hospitals are not providing the best and safest option in many circumstances. And so free birth is an iatrogenic phenomenon, what we call a medically caused phenomenon or circumstance, where the current services are forcing women to consider and find a better way to birth, because the other ways of giving birth outside of hospital, with or without midwives, are presenting themselves with significantly more benefits than perceived risks when women compare it to the option of giving birth in hospital. So in my thesis, I propose that rising free birth rates are a result of poor maternity care services, not poor decision-making from women. That's all I've got to say about that today. And if you want to hear more about free birth, and particularly if you're a care provider and you're keen to engage with the topic of free birth and women who do free birth, and if you're curious to know how you can best care for women who are planning a free birth, particularly these women don't always have free births. They sometimes do need to come to our hospital services or our midwifery services in order to receive care if they've identified an issue. And so on the 23rd of July, I am speaking for All for Maternity in a free birth forum and seminar series all about engaging with free birth. If you want to learn more about free birth and how to care for women who are planning a free birth, then I would encourage you to sign up for this seminar series with All for Maternity. The links are in the show notes, and I do believe that you can buy the recordings if you're listening to this after the 23rd of July. To get free access to all the research that's used to create each podcast episode, you can join the mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com, or you can join our members hub and financially support the work of this podcast. In the hub, you can ask me questions, and premium members get access to a monthly Q&A episode where I answer listener questions. You'll also get episode transcripts and additional resources for each podcast episode. All the details are in the show notes.